Very warm welcome to all of you. I'm Deepak Krishnadas and welcome to the Fortune Dialogues. Fortune Dialogues is a series which the Fortune IS Academy regularly conducts. We've been conducting different kinds of talks and discussions over the years. And today we are kick-starting our session for 2022. And to set off our first session in 2022, we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Stanly Johny. I extend my warm welcome to him. He's been supportive of us in the past and has been a speaker for us in the last year as well, wherein we had an excellent session related to the geopolitics of West Asia. Welcome, sir. And today we'll be we have him for yet another interesting session. Dr. Stanly Johny is one of the foremost experts on international politics. He is the international affairs editor of The Hindu, and he has reported for The Hindu group from different places like Brussels, Luxembourg, Moscow, Singapore, Tel Aviv, Ramallah, and the list just goes on. He completed his master's in international studies from JNU. He also has in West Asian studies. He also has a PhD from JNU, from the School of International Studies, and focusing on Middle Eastern studies with a focus on Hezbollah and Lebanon. He's also an IVLP fellow of the US State Department and is a prolific writer. And apart from his regular columns, podcast in The Hindu, we also see his articles in EPW, Frontline, and many other. And he regularly contributes to think tanks in India as well as abroad, like the Middle East Institute in Washington and in Singapore. He's also the author of the book, The ISIS Caliphate from Syria to the Doorsteps of India. And I remember last time when we had the session, that was a time when we were anticipating the release of his next book. And the wait is almost over. The books are actually the next book, The Comrades and the Mullas, China, Afghanistan, and the New Asian Geopolitics, a book which he has co-authored with Mr. Anand Krishnan, published by HarperCollins, is hitting the shelves next soon, in a few weeks' time. And most of us are eagerly waiting for it. And because we are very thrilled to be actually get our hands on the book. Today's topic is one of extremely important relevance to the contemporary things which are happening right now. From Afghanistan to Ukraine, shifts in the post-Cold War order. Now, the abrupt withdrawal of the Americans from Afghanistan and the things unfolding after that, many people have already started to forget that. And now the entire attention is fixed on something as we speak, on the things that are unraveling in Ukraine. Is there going to be a war? Whether a war is going to break out between Russia or the Ukraine and the different events related to that. But the fact is, in international politics, seldom does different events remain unconnected. And it takes an expert to actually find that connection, because no two events are remain unconnected or remain in silos. All of these events in the broader landscape or in the broader canvas of geopolitics, of international politics, all these events, seemingly isolated events, are connected, and they signal a broad shift in world politics, a broad shift in world order. And this is what we are waiting to hear from Dr. Stanly. And so without further ado, Dr. Stanly, welcome once again. Thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to your session. Thank you.
Thanks, Deepak, for the kind introduction. And thanks to Fortune Academy for having me here. Glad to be back talking to some of the future diplomats and bureaucrats, etc., etc. Very happy to be here. And I remember last year, Deepak, you talked about my book. The book is available for pre-order now. Very glad to share that as well. It will be out on March 8th, around March 8th. And thank you very much for your interest. Now, coming to the topic. As you mentioned, Deepak, in the introduction, some of you might be wondering why Afghanistan is sitting together with Ukraine. Afghanistan is, at the meeting point of Central and South Asia, here in our neighborhood. And then Ukraine is on the easternmost flank of Europe. So what is, what these two countries have to do in common with what we call the shifts in the global politics. We will come to that. Right now, I think everybody, including myself, everybody seems to be, looking for answers on what Russia is doing around Ukraine, or what President Vladimir Putin wants. So this is a question that is being, circulated in international commentaries, even in India. So everybody wants to know what is the state of mind of the Russian leader. I think an equally important question is why Mr. Putin is doing this now. Because you see, the trigger of the Ukraine crisis is the Russian mobilization. The immediate trigger is the Russian mobilization, the mobilization of Russian troops around Ukraine. So as of now, Russia has mobilized, according to the Americans, some 150,000 troops, which includes its elite, open terrain fighting forces, professional fighting forces, and S-400 missile defense systems, some 500 combat aircraft, around 40 warships in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, and surface-to-surface missiles, and S-400 missile defense systems, reconnaissance drones, etc., etc. It's a massive mobilization, perhaps the biggest mobilization since the end of the Cold War. So why? So one question obvious is why he is doing it, and another is why he is doing this now. I think to understand this question, we need to take a deeper look at what is happening in international politics in the recent past, in a larger scale. So, interestingly, when the United States pulled out of Afghanistan in August last year, there were two different arguments about it. One was that the United States was pulling back from Afghanistan at its will. It fought 20 years in Afghanistan, and then it decided to withdraw because it has other issues to focus on, especially China. China was rising as a big power. So the United States has to stay strategically focused on China. So it has decided to pull back from Afghanistan. That's one argument is. It is important because the China factor, I think, played an important role in the United States' decision to pull back from Afghanistan. But at the same time, the second argument is that the United States was forced to withdraw from Afghanistan because after fighting 20 years of war in Afghanistan, it failed to win the war. So it was forced to withdraw, pull back from Afghanistan. So I am inclined to, take the second argument. I had written in 2019 February, a year before the United States signed the agreement with the Taliban in Doha, that the Americans had lost the war in Afghanistan. So the thing is that great powers do not vacate their spheres of influence at will. Always they are forced to do that. And when they are forced to do that, there will be repercussions. Because the problem is that, with the former argument that the United States pulled back troops from Afghanistan at its will, because it went there, to do something, it fought 20 years, and then it got bored, and then it left Afghanistan. That is one way of looking at it. But the problem with this argument is that the Vladimir Putins, the Xi Jinpings, and Ayatollah Khamenei's may not buy this argument. They might look at the United States, fighting the United States, which is the preeminent power in today's global order, the world's largest economy, the world's biggest and most powerful military force. It went into Afghanistan to bring in a regime change, to defeat Al-Qaeda, to defeat the Taliban. It stayed put in Afghanistan for 20 years, and 15 days before the United States announced withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Taliban were back in power in Kabul. So for a great power of the United States scale, it was definitely an ignominious exit from Afghanistan. You see, this, if you look at the past, such setbacks for great powers had triggered responses from their rivals in the past. Say, for example, if you look at the Suez crisis in 1956, Israel attacked, in the event of the Suez Dam crisis, Israel attacked Egypt with help from France and Britain. So Britain, until the Second World War, Britain was the most important power in the region in West Asia, right? But after the Second World War, Britain ceased to be a great power. Right now you look at the Ukraine crisis, the British government keeps making statements, but I don't think anybody is paying any attention to what the Brits are saying. I mean, I'm not saying to spite them, I'm saying in terms of if you look at the great power balance, Britain stopped being a great power after the Second World War. But in the Suez crisis, Britain actually supported the Israeli invasion, the Israeli attack on the Suez Canal, and it overstretched itself, only to be repudiated by the two existing great powers of that time, the Soviet Union and the United States, right? And both the Americans and the Soviets asked the British and the Israelis to pull back from Suez. And the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev even threatened to fire rockets into Israel unless Israel pulls back from Suez. And the American President Eisenhower threatened them with sanctions. So basically, they had to finally pull back. So historians identify, the Suez crisis as the most defining moment of the end of British influence in the region. Like, for example, you come to the 1970s, the United States was defeated in Vietnam. In 1975, the United States had to withdraw from Vietnam. So 1970s for the United States was particularly a bad decade during the Cold War, right? So in 1975, it was forced to withdraw from Vietnam. In 1978, there was a communist revolution in Afghanistan. And in 1979, the Soviets were in Afghanistan. And in early 1979, there was a revolution in Iran. Iran was one of the, blocks of one of the pillars of American foreign policy in the Middle East. The United States lost Iran as well. So during the Cold War, if you look at the Cold War history, 1970s was a decade of setbacks for the United States. And you can see the interconnectedness between these developments, because the United States withdrawal from Vietnam led the Soviet leaders, Brezhnev and his Politburo, to believe that the Americans were at a moment of weakness, and this was the time for them to seize the momentum. So what the Soviets did, they backed a communist coup in Afghanistan, and 1 year later, they sent troops to Afghanistan, right, to expand the Soviet influence across the Central Asian region. So that, in fact, that itself, that provided an opportunity to the United States in the long term. That's a different story. But how great powers look at each other. This is one example. The Afghan issue is one example. Because, international system, if you are a realist, the international system is largely anarchic. Because there is no supranational body with powers to protect a weak power against a greater power. Of course, we have international organizations. We have the United Nations. We have the United Nations Security Council. We have international laws, other organizations, etc., etc. But when it comes to great power behavior, these international organizations do not act as a deterrence, right? The United Nations did not stop the United States from invading Iraq in 2003, right? The United Nations did not stop Russia from annexing Crimea in 2014. And the United Nations and other international organizations may not stop President Vladimir Putin from what he is going to do next. So we have international organizations to, let's say, to retain some kind of an order, a semblance of an order. But at the same time, great powers behave in a completely different way. The problem is that in an anarchic international order, so what states, especially great powers, what states have to do, their primary interest is survival, according to realist thinkers, and have to survive in an anarchic order by constantly expanding your powers. And when you expand your powers, you always do that at the expense of somebody else, some other states. So this is, Mearsheimer calls it offensive realism. So this perpetual tendency of expanding power of a state, especially when he calls it offensive realism when he talks about great powers. So in today's context, let's say when I say great power, I'm largely referring to three countries: the United States, China, and Russia. So you need the geographical size, you need population, you need the economic size or military power. Russia lacks the economic clout, but in terms of its geography and its military might, I think it stands, it qualifies to be called a great power. The United States, of course, is the world's preeminent power, and China is the world's largest, is the second largest economy. It's the most populous country. It's the second largest military force, the world's largest navy, and definitely it is the prime challenger of the United States hold over the international order right now, right? So, so this is how great powers always behave, and that's how they behaved in the past as well. So when we come to the current crisis, the issue is that there are, the United States, when it was forced to withdraw from Afghanistan, there were two issues. One is that obvious, the factor I mentioned, that it was an ignominious exit that created a perception of weakness, or what I call great power fatigue. So great powers also have fatigue. So the United States was facing was going through a phase of great power fatigue right now, because the signs of this fatigue was there. It invaded Iraq in 2003 and eventually turning Iran into a regional superpower. It invaded Libya in 2011, turning Libya into an anarchic country of two governments right now. That also caused the spread of jihadist violence across West Africa and the Sahel region. Incidentally, France pulled back from Mali yesterday. President Macron announced it yesterday, after 10 years of fighting terrorists in Mali without practically achieving anything. And the cause for this terrorist spread in the Sahel region, West Africa, so it started from the American or the NATO invasion of Libya in 2011. So you had these symptoms in the past of this great power fatigue, but I think that has reached at an important level, at an important point with the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan. So that great power fatigue is there on the one side. And on the other side, the United States has clearly declared that China is going to be its focus. It wants to shift its strategic focus to the Asia Pacific region. So that's what, so these two factors are there. But there is a problem. The problem is that the post-Cold War security architecture in Europe is an unsettled matter, at least from the Russian point of view. Because, when the Soviet Union collapsed, when the Cold War came to end, the United States was the victor of the Cold War, right? And Russia, which is the successor of the Soviet Union, it lost millions of square kilometers when the Soviet Union died. And its economy was in shambles. It didn't have an inspiring leadership. The country was in a free fall. It was going through a spiral of crisis, Russia at that time. And NATO, which was originally formed in 1949, as a bulwark against the Soviet Union to challenge the Soviet influence in the Atlantic world. So Russia was definitely, at that time, Russia had its concerns. And the Western leaders promised Russia that NATO would not expand by an inch towards the east. So the German unification in 1990, after that, East Germany, which was part of the Warsaw Pact, it became part of NATO. After that, the Western leaders told Russia that no more expansion, to kind of soothe the nerves of the Russian bear, right? So, but the problem is that Russia, it suffered a setback during this time, throughout the 1990s. But in terms of, as I said, in terms of its military might and its geographical size, Russia has the potential to reclaim its lost great power status. In the 1990s, it was not in a position to do that. And then in early 2000s, the Russian economy, under the leadership of President Putin, the Russian economy was making a comeback, riding the commodity boom. And also, he was also remaking the military force, rebuilding the state. I mean, definitely on authoritarian terms, you can call him an authoritarian or a managed democrat, what Perry Anderson called him. whatever you want to call him, but he was basically focused on rebuilding the Russian state that was completely dismantled after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And then this NATO expansion, the promise the West made to Russia, that promise was not kept, because you can see that the former in the 1990s itself, by the late 1990s, the former Warsaw Pact countries like Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, so all these countries were taken into NATO. And Russia was not in a position to, despite this being a breach of promise, Russia was not in a position to challenge the West. So that's why I called it an unsettled security architecture of Europe, because NATO continued its eastward expansion at the expense of Russia's pre-existing influence in the region. But in 2000s, after rebuilding the Russian state, Russian economy, and gaining some kind of confidence, the Russian state started responding to this open door expansionary policy of NATO. So the trigger was that in 2008, again in 2004, the three Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, all three share border with Russia. And if you look at the map, you can see Estonia is the closest to St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg is the second most populous city of the Russian core land. It was the capital of the Tsarist Russia. And from the Estonian border to St. Petersburg, it's less than 200 kilometers. So NATO has come to that close for Russia. During the Cold War, the only border NATO had with Russia was the northern fringes of Norway, which was a small strip of land. But now, if you look at NATO, it has come very close to, it has come 200 kilometers within the range of St. Petersburg, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So all the Baltic countries became NATO members in 2004, right? And in 2008, in the Bucharest summit of NATO in Romania, the United States President, George Bush at that time, he promised membership, offered NATO membership to Ukraine and Georgia, and two other former Soviet countries. I'll just share a map to show how these two countries are important for Russia. Oh, I'm not able to share this, huh?
Just give us a moment's time. Let me see.
Yeah. So if you look at the map, you can see these two, Georgia and Ukraine. These two are Black Sea basin countries. And Black Sea, Russian leaders have historically considered Black Sea as a Russian lake, right? And Black Sea is also the opening for Russia to the Mediterranean Sea. So Russia has a Black Sea fleet, which is based in Crimea, the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea. And then it has a Mediterranean fleet, which is on Syria, right? And Black Sea opens into the Mediterranean Sea, and from the Mediterranean Sea into the Atlantic Ocean. So Black Sea for Russia, Black Sea is very fundamental for its force projection. And Georgia and Ukraine are both Black Sea basin countries. And Ukraine is also close to the Russian capital, Moscow. There used to be, I don't know if that train is there, there used to be a train from Moscow to Ukraine, which would take you to Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital, within a few hours. The distance from the Ukrainian border to Russia is less than 500 kilometers. So if NATO comes to Ukraine, there are two challenges for Russia. One is, of course, is that NATO, which has already come closer to St. Petersburg, would come closer to Moscow. And then secondly, Black Sea, already Turkey is a Black Sea country, and then Turkey is a NATO member. And if two more countries join the Black Sea, you see the Russian access to the Black Sea would be shrunken further. So that in 2008, the NATO offer for membership to Georgia and Ukraine, that was seen as an existential threat in Moscow. So what Mr. Putin did, in 2008, there was already an existing conflict within Georgia, in South Asia and Abkhazia, two regions where there was this separatist conflict was going on between the Georgian government and the rebels in this region. So Russia sent troops to these two regions to push back the rebels, and then to push back the Georgian army and support the rebels in these two self-declared republics. South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So by doing that, basically, Russia has created or intensified the existing separatist conflict in Georgia. So the problem, why Mr. Putin did this is that, in NATO, we know that there is an Article 15 in NATO, which means if you are a NATO member, if you come under attack, and you can trigger this article and you can ask for the entire NATO defenses support, which means NATO is supposed to come for your defense, right? So if a country has a pre-existing conflict, this country would not be taken into NATO. And if that pre-existing conflict is with Russia, from NATO's point of view, taking Georgia in would be equal to fighting a future war with Russia. That would be disastrous for both sides. So by sending troops to Georgia, Putin had effectively ended Georgia's claims for NATO membership. And then when it comes to Ukraine, again in 2014, you see that in 2014 there was this popular Western-backed popular movement in Ukraine that brought down the pro-Russian government of Viktor Yanukovych. So after which Russia had annexed Crimea. So Crimea, as I said, Crimea is a Black Sea peninsula. And then Crimea was hosting Russia's Black Sea fleet. So if Ukraine has completely gone to the western side, Russia feared that it could lose access to Crimea, and also its influence on the Black Sea would be squeezed out further. So what Putin did, he did two things. One, he started supporting the rebels in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbas region. Right, there are two self-declared republics again, Luhansk and Donetsk. And then he annexed Crimea. He annexed Crimea through a referendum. The entire political class in Crimea switched loyalty to Russia. And then they orchestrated a referendum, the legality of which is disputed, but still. And then Crimea was taken into Russia in 2014. So by doing that, he did two things. One, he kept the Russian Black Sea fleet. Secondly, again, like what he did in Georgia, by creating or intensifying a conflict in eastern Ukraine, he had effectively ended Ukraine joining NATO. So this is what he did in 2014. Now the question is, if Putin had achieved his tactical goals, such as preventing Georgia and Ukraine from joining NATO. Now, everybody can say, NATO can say that we have an open door policy, Georgia is welcome to apply, Ukraine is welcome to apply. And Ukrainian leader Zelensky can say that we have a constitutional commitment to join NATO and we will continue to pursue it's our right, etc., etc. But these all are rhetorical comments. If you cut through the clutter, basically everybody knows that Georgia and Ukraine are not going to join NATO in the foreseeable future. That has been effectively ruled out. But my question is, if Mr. Putin has achieved these, his tactical goals, then why is he mobilizing troops now? So I think my sense is that the larger Russian goal is to rewrite the security architecture of Europe, the post-Cold War security architecture of Europe, because the Russians believe that this was at the expense of Russia's security. Right. So you must have stopped Ukraine and Georgia for now, but maybe 10 years later or 15 years or 20 years later, if the conflict in eastern Ukraine and Georgia are stabilized, these two countries could take NATO membership and NATO could come closer to Russia. Or rather, this open door policy of NATO, this continued expansion of NATO, Russia sees that as a major security threat. So Russia wants it to be stopped. So this is what I think Mr. Putin wants to do. And he sees now, at a time when the United States and NATO, to be specific, was forced to withdraw from Afghanistan after fighting the Taliban, after having failed to defeat the Taliban, they pulled back from Afghanistan. So there is this natural, what we say, disinterest, or rather strategic disinterest in the United States to pick more conflicts, because it had, after what it suffered in Afghanistan, or rather in Iraq, And the United States also, there is a consensus in Washington, D.C. that the United States should stay focused on China. And if you want to stay focused on China, you shouldn't get involved in other conflicts further. Right? So Mr. Putin thinks that this is the moment, this is the opportune moment, because these two factors sit together. One is that after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, there's growing consensus in Washington, D.C. against picking more conflicts. Mr. Biden has already ruled out that he wouldn't ruled out any kind of military confrontation with Russia in the event of the Ukraine crisis. The only response the US is threatening Russia with is sanctions. And I don't think Mr. Putin can be deterred by sanctions. In 2014 also, they had imposed sanctions on Russia. Then what happened? Nothing major happened, right? And the United States has clearly ruled out any kind of military response to Russia. So the Russians had factored that in. They knew that after Afghanistan, this is one thing. And then secondly, if the United States wants to stay focused on China, which means Russia is their secondary objective or their secondary priority. So the Russians think that this is the time to make the move for their strategic goal. And their strategic goal is to rewrite the post-Cold War security architecture of Europe. How this can be achieved, we don't know. I mean, if you look at the negotiations that emerged in the between Russia and West, the West has already made some concessions to Russia. The West has said that, okay, we won't give any legal guarantees on changing NATO's open door policy, etc., etc. That's right. But at the same time, Mr. Biden, if you look at Biden's statement 2 days ago, he said that we don't have any missiles in Ukraine. We are not going to plan to implant any missiles in Ukraine. In December, Mr. Biden also told President Putin that the United States doesn't have any plans to deploy permanent combat troops in Ukraine. And the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said that the Ukraine joining NATO is not on the agenda. Yesterday, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said that, yeah, there is opposition to Ukraine joining NATO from within the NATO, and the process has stalled, right? And the United States is also telling the Russians that they are ready to reconsider some of the American military presence and military drills in Eastern Europe on a reciprocal basis. So there are talking points. The talking points have emerged. And the United States has also effectively, the United States and the West in general, have effectively recognized the Russian concerns that for a new equilibrium, security equilibrium in Europe, there need to be talks between these two sides. The Russians have been talking about NATO's expansion since 1990s, but nothing has happened. The West had not taken them seriously, but now everybody has reached a point where they can't ignore the Russian concerns anymore. So I think that's what the Russians actually wanted to achieve. And now we are here. So we don't know what is going to happen next. There are still potential points that could lead to conflict, especially the conflict that's going on in eastern Ukraine. Yesterday there were reports of shelling that could escalate. You don't know what's going to happen. But the main point is that I think in a larger international order, where the United States is no longer, let's say, the unipolar center of the world. The United States' ability to shape political outcomes, geopolitical outcomes elsewhere is receding. And the Ukraine crisis, because in the past crisis, let's say, where the United States suffered setbacks, where it is Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. So in all these countries, the US went into these countries and it faced local resistance. That can always happen with a great power. It happened with Russia in Afghanistan. It happened with the Americans in Vietnam in the past. It happened with France in Africa. So that can always happen. So those were the signs we were watching. But now the difference with the current crisis is that Russia, which is another great power, is directly challenging the United States or the NATO's hold over the European security architecture using force. That we hadn't seen in the past 30 years since the death of the Soviet Union. So that is the major difference with the Ukrainian crisis. Russia is challenging the security order with force, with military force. So that, I think, is the sharpest demonstration of the depth of American unipolarity, which doesn't mean the United States would lose its influence. I don't mean that. The United States remains the world's most preeminent power. But like the 1970s, the 2000, let's say 2020s, the United States faces immense foreign policy challenges because it's already out of Afghanistan. Out of Afghanistan means it has lost access to South Asia, right? Now, the United States bases in the Gulf. Even in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia is acting differently so that the United States is cultivating the UAE and Qatar. So, and China, both China and Russia, they have got the United States out of their backyard in Afghanistan, right? And that would embolden them further. And the American withdrawal from Afghanistan has already driven the Central Asian countries further into the Russian embrace. You can see that in, in Kazakhstan, what happened recently. So Russia is actively playing a bigger role in Central Asia as well. And American withdrawal from Afghanistan has also deepened the security fears of the major powers in continental Asia, including India. Because India also sees the return of the Taliban in Afghanistan as a major challenge. The Americans could just leave Afghanistan because Afghanistan was not posing them any direct security challenge, right? The United States is far away. It's protected by the world's two great oceans, the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. But we Indians are not like that. Afghanistan is in your extended neighborhood. So any security changes in Afghanistan would pose security challenges to you, to your calculations. So the American withdrawal from Afghanistan already has had these security implications. It has emboldened Russia and China further. It has driven the countries in the region, especially the Central Asian countries, into the Russian embrace. And it has also created a great power fatigue. And on the other side, the United States has already announced that its strategic focus is going to be on the Indo-Pacific region. And that has opened up an opportunity for the Russians to settle, or at least to seek settling, the unsettled security architecture of the post-Cold War Europe. I think this is what we are witnessing right now. We don't know where it is heading to. It's, I mean, like anybody else, I'm also closely observing what's happening. So that's it. I think the world is going to be diverse. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stanley. This has been extreme. I mean, it's been enriching. There are pages and pages which I have noted. And yes, and I'm glad that you've connected the historical facts right from the time of the Suez and how the British eminence has dropped, because it's very important to understand those past events in world history, in order to analyze many of those international events and political changes which are happening right now. And I'm sure the audience must have benefited from it as well. And yes, regarding this unsettled security architecture of Europe, as you said, this seems to be the most logical reason, something which we can at least predict for now. Just a note to the audience, you can please post your questions in the chat box. We will be accommodating your questions how much ever possible. And so before we get into that, see, when we say that the US withdrawal, I am actually bringing a continuation from our previous session, because last time when we had, you did mention that this was a time when things were still unraveling in Afghanistan. So you had in a way predicted, it's kind of prophetical now, that the American withdrawal from Central Asia, from Afghanistan, is a part of a larger trend of their, of giving less focus on Central Asia and then going towards Indo-Pacific. But even when they say that, or when you see all those signals happening, but what kind of message does it send to even partners in the Indo-Pacific? Because see, you can already see that there is kind of fissures in the transatlantic alliance, because there are definitely, because Indo-Pacific is now an arena where so many players are playing. And of course, China is of significant concern to countries, including India. But then what kind of a message would United States be sending when, abruptly you see an inward looking foreign policy, or when you have some kind of a withdrawal from all those areas?
Yeah. So I think the United States focus on the Indo-Pacific region is, we can say that the Americans take it very seriously because they realize that after a long time, they realize that China is the real challenge to them. Because, Russia, right, Russia remains a major military power. But if you look at a country's ability to challenge the United States hold over the international order, and that's going to be China, it's not going to be Russia, right?
Exactly.
Because China, as I said, China has already built vast economic resources. And it is just started to exercise its strategic option. Just started. Russia's been there around for quite some time. So for the United States and United States, I think for years the United States was driven by this illusion that trade with China or globalization, everything would eventually lead to the Chinese state changing its behavior, like the so-called liberal theory, right? And what you had now is that China, the U.S. policies, practically emboldened China in the international fora, and then China is now out there to challenge you. That's how great powers work. I mean, once if you have economic resources, you will convert it into military resources, and if you have economic and military resources, you will start dominating your region, right? That's what the United States did in Western Hemisphere. The United States in 1962, when Khrushchev landed nuclear missiles in Cuba, what Kennedy did? Kennedy threatened military action, right? Kennedy imposed a naval blockade on Cuba. So, it's like that. So it was, I think, it was predictable that China's behavior was, at least those who were closely following this, the foreign policy of this region. And the United States now realizes that they have reached that moment where they cannot ignore China anymore. And in Afghanistan, anyway, they had lost the war. That also, I think the Americans had reached that conclusion long ago, that they can't win the war in Afghanistan. All they wanted was a face-saving exit. And Obama in 2015, I think Obama had sent a delegate to hold negotiations with the Taliban. And Trump actually picked it from there. And then he appointed a special envoy, entered this agreement. And that agreement itself was, it was kind of giving into the Taliban in every sense. But what the Americans wanted was a face-saving exit, because they wanted to exit a lost theater to focus on a greater challenge. That's what they wanted to do. But the problem with that, as I said, it may not work like that. If you are a big power, you used to be a global policeman. You used to be the center of the global order. If you are in that position, you cannot have a strategy focused only on Indo-Pacific. You need to have a global strategy. What the United States tried to do was to exit the lost theaters to focus on the Indo-Pacific, but that would only embolden different rivals of yours. Like you can see that in the nuclear negotiations with Iran. Iran is, maybe the Biden administration might have thought it would be easy if the Americans are ready to renegotiate with Iran, but Iran is giving them a tough time. And like what Putin is doing now in Ukraine. So it doesn't work like that. And then secondly, the kind of message it's giving it to partners. The problem with, India is a classic example. For India, the United States is the most important strategic partner at this point of time, right? And Indians have said that in as many words on many occasions. But at the same time, the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, India is not just a continental, not just a maritime power. It's also a continental power, right? And the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the United States wants to focus on the Indo-Pacific, which India would like to see the US focus on the Indo-Pacific to kind of tackle China's rise. From an Indian point of view, India would like to see that. But the contradiction is that in order to do that, when the United States exited Afghanistan, that has enhanced India's continental security concerns, because India was already facing the pressure on its border with China. And with Pakistan, you have this trouble for decades. And with the return of the Taliban to Afghanistan, basically Pakistan got more strategic depth, and China is ready to embrace the Taliban. So India's continental strategy is now facing challenges. Whereas the American withdrawal and its shift towards the Indo-Pacific, India would like to see that, in its maritime strategy. So this is how the contradictions work. It is a tough time for India as well. So I think, this is what the United States is serious about its Indo-Pacific strategy. But the problem is that in order to, while taking this serious approach towards Indo-Pacific region, the United States actions are actually leaving its partners in continental Asia in a security dilemma. And this is the reason India is now trying to deepen its relationship with Central Asia and Russia. That is the contradiction. Because if you want to address your continental security challenges, you can't ignore Russia anymore, especially
Exactly.
with Taliban back in power in Afghanistan.
Correct. Absolutely, because even in the China question, we are trying to get increasingly close to Moscow. And again, as you said, with the emergence of Taliban, that makes it very, very important. So I was about to ask a question related to the European EU, but before that, what about the other implications on India? What would be the other implications on India?
So I think if it's on the Ukraine crisis, see, India's position is more or less consistent.
Correct.
In 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, at that time, there was a different government at Delhi, right? Manmohan Singh was the prime minister, early 2014, when the annexation happened. India has this historical policy of respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of every country. But despite having that policy, the Indians did nothing to upset the Russians. They were very cautious. So when the Russian annexation of Crimea, because see, effectively what Russia did was to take a part of Ukraine, right? So from an international moralist point of view, it was an aggression. But you can say that the Russians didn't send troops, they didn't, it was almost a bloodless annexation. All these arguments are there. And there was a referendum, etc., etc. The regional parliament shifted loyalty to Moscow. Fine. I would say that Putin had executed it rather cleverly. But if you look at it from an international legal point of view, this was an annexation. Crimea was part of Ukraine. But when it came to the UN General Assembly, India abstained from voting in 2014. And again in 2020, and again in late 2014, when after the BJP government was voted to power. So, and when Mr. Putin visited India, the Crimean leader, the leader of the Crimean Republic, was part of the delegation. So that was equal to India recognizing the Russian annexation of Crimea. So that is the message India had sent out to the world. And back then, the Ukrainian president Petro Poroshenko had blasted India, saying that India shouldn't do this, etc., etc. And again in 2020, when Ukraine had initiated another resolution in the UN General Assembly condemning the human rights violations in Crimea, India voted against it. So because the resolution was targeting the Russians, right? And then a couple of weeks ago in the UN Security Council, India is now sitting in the UN Security Council, when again the Americans initiated a resolution to discuss this matter in the Security Council, India abstained from it. So you look at India's public posturing. So India has taken a consistent position that in the international fora, India wouldn't do anything to upset Russian sentiments on the Ukraine question. And why India is doing it, I think, there are two arguments about it. One is, of course, is that, especially you see that in Western commentaries, which says that, a potential Russian attack on Ukraine would invite more sanctions on Russia. And to offset sanctions, Russia will have to turn more towards China. So any Ukrainian crisis would drive Russia further into a Chinese embrace. And then that would pose security and other kind of challenges to India. And China would also look at how the West is responding to Russia over Ukraine. And based on that, Chinese own aggressive behavior would be emboldened, posing security challenges to India. This is one argument. The other argument is that if, the whole problem of this crisis is that Russia doesn't want to play second fiddle to the West in Europe, right? That is the crux of the current crisis. If Russia is creating such a ruckus over this fundamental problem, why should Russia play second fiddle to China in the future? So this is the counter argument. And also, if there are sanctions on Russia by the West, which means Russia would need India further, because India is a big market. And India had proven that right while agreeing to sticking to the S-400 missile defense system despite American sanctions, right? So the counter argument is that even if there would be a crisis over Ukraine, that means Russia cannot completely ignore India's sentiments, and India needs Russia for its as part of its continental strategy and also defense supplies. So I think New Delhi at this point of time is subscribing to the second argument.
Correct. If I remember correctly, I think during the Manmohan Singh government, the term phrase which was used was legitimate security interest in support of when Russia annexed Crimea. I'll just build on to a question asked by one among our audience, and that is related to, do you see fissures between the US and European Union, or even within EU, that could prevent a strong collaboration against Russia? So I think this is a very relevant question, because even within Europe, you see kind of different voices. Because when you see Emmanuel Macron going and then coming back and saying, see, we need to listen to the Russian point of view. And you have Olaf Scholz, so Germany actually saying, okay, they are barring, German-made weapons to be used against in the event of a conflict. So you see the priority would be on gas, the concerns on Nord Stream. So there seems to be a different, there seems to be a wide variety of interest. And as you said, you have other Eastern European nations like even the Visegrad countries like Hungary, which has generally been more having a more affinity towards Russia. So do you see post this crisis a structural change or some kind of a change in relation within the EU itself towards Russia?
Yeah, I think this crisis has clearly shown that the West is not divided as President Biden claimed it is. Right? 3 European leaders visited Russia in the past 2 weeks, and the fourth one is going to visit. The Italian Prime Minister also going. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban and German Chancellor Scholz and French President Emmanuel Macron. And Macron said, while going to Russia, that Russia's concerns should be respected.
Exactly.
And then Macron has tried to revive the Normandy process to address the internal issue, which means the Franco-German, Russian, Ukrainian talks to address the crisis in Donbass in Ukraine. And Olaf Scholz, who visited Moscow a couple of days ago, has said that in public twice, both in Kyiv and in Kremlin and in Moscow, that Ukraine joining NATO is not on the agenda. So clearly, while the United States retain that tempo of rhetoric against Russia, from Europe you can see messages of reconciliation or concessions. And I was talking to Ambassador Raghavan yesterday, who was the former chairman of India's National Security Advisory Board. And I asked him the same question about Europe. So he told me this: NATO has 30 members. 28 European countries and 2 North American countries, the United States and Canada. So of course, so he used it. He said it, like this. He said the relationship with Russia or the crisis with Russia is existential for Europe, and existential and short term or immediate for Europe, whereas for the United States, it's strategic and long term. I think this difference is very important. And again, Walter Russell Mead recently wrote that the Ukrainian crisis showed that Europe has never been this divided. The West has never been this divided during the Cold War. In a sense, among the Western Bloc. So Cold War, the division was between West and East, and the Western Bloc always stayed together against the Soviet Union. But that unity you can't see anymore. And I'm sure that Putin is betting on that as well, because definitely Scholz and Macron do not want a war in Europe.
Correct. Absolutely. Another question from one among audience, kind of interesting. Will the current crisis empower or organizations like the SEO? So when we are talking about, a Russia, a Russo-Chinese, a strategic alignment. So, and when we are talking about an organization like SEO, so will that play a role in Central Asia?
Yeah, it's likely. In a sense, I think Russia's tactical position is that it wanted to strengthen its relationship with China, definitely. So you can see the photographs also, no? When Putin met Macron or Scholz, there was this long table.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the Kremlin says because they refused to take COVID tests, but fine. But look at the body language of Putin and Xi Jinping. So they were
Exactly.
close at the opening of the winter ceremony, next to next.
Correct.
Like very close. So I think this could also be messaging. So Putin was saying that he was not going personally close to anybody, not even to his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, but with Xi Jinping, he was very close. So I think for now, the Russian strategy is to work deeper with China. And the United States has contributed immensely to this because, the United States has officially, the Pentagon has officially called both Russia and China revisionist powers. So they have officially declared that these two are our enemies. So it's natural that these two will come together. So if you read George Kennan's original long telegram, which he sent in the 1940s on how to contain the Soviet Union, he says the United States' most important strategic goal should be to prevent a Russo-Chinese consolidation, which he calls Eurasian consolidation. One is a European power, Russia, and the other is an Asian power. And these two coming together, if you look at the landmass, this is huge, right? And both were major powers also, and both were communist countries. In 1949, China became communist, Russia was communist, which won the Second World War. So if these two coming together would pose immense strategic threat to the United States. And this, I think, this was the reason of the US outreach to China, despite Korean War, despite Vietnam War, despite everything, in 1970s, early 1970s, Kissinger went to Beijing, Nixon went to Beijing, met Mao Zedong. And the Chinese were ready to embrace the Americans against the Soviets, against their communist Soviet brothers, right? They stayed together for decades. So I think this was the American strategy during Cold War. And the Americans seem to have lost that strategic focus, at least on this area, because their simultaneous hostility towards both China and Russia are driving these two countries together, which could pose further strategic challenges. But I think, if you ask me, SEO would be strengthened, the Russia-Chinese cooperation would be strengthened, etc., etc. All this could happen. But I think in the future, once this European security issue is settled, and that's what the Russians want, once this is settled, if there is no war in Ukraine this time, this is also an opportunity and also a challenge. If there is no war, this leads to further diplomatic talks. If the security issue is settled, I think a future American president could reach out to Russia.
Yes, we'll have to wait and see.
Because they have already identified, because they would see that China is their most important threat.
Correct. Now, since we talked so much about China, and there are many people who have pointed out this question, and since we talked about the diplomatic signaling, so in a way, what about China and Taiwan? Like, see, the entire sequence of events, the abrupt US withdrawal and the lack of commitment towards what has been agreed in the past, isn't this sending a strategic signaling for China from the Chinese perspective on Taiwan?
Definitely. So China has stepped up sending its military aircraft towards the Taiwan air defense zone in recent months. That was also coming after the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, because China also sees that the United States is not ready to pick direct conflict at this time, and China has already established some kind of dominance over the South China Sea region. So it wants to further extend its dominance. So China is clearly sending signals that it wants to retake Taiwan. definitely. And I think the Chinese would be looking closely at the Ukraine issue, how this turns out, how the West is responding to Russia. And based on that, I think the Chinese would take a decision. So eventually, China would like to take back Taiwan because the Chinese rulers think that would end the century of humiliation, because they have got back everything else, right? Manchuria from
Yes.
Japan, Hong Kong from the British, Macau from the Portuguese, and Taiwan is the only region that's left that was part of Imperial China at one point of time, that is outside the Chinese control, and they would like to take Taiwan back. When they will do, we never know. So if at all they are doing it, if at all they are planning a military takeover of Taiwan, I think it could happen within years, because once the structures of the new Cold War is in place, it would be extremely difficult for China. It would be as difficult for China to take Taiwan back, as difficult for the Soviet Union and East Germany to take the West Berlin back.
Exactly.
So it could happen before the structures of the Cold War is in place. So it's interesting. We should look how or where this is leading to.
Yes, absolutely. I have a few more questions, which are again talking about India. So wherein, apart from the, our strategic interest or how we are managing this crisis, there are a couple of people who are asking, is there going to be an economic impact? Because I think we do import from Ukraine, like, edible oil. Apart from palm oil, we do import other things. So is there going to be a huge, or I would say a significant economic impact in that, in case if conflict or the situation sees an escalation?
Yeah, the significant economic impact would be on energy prices. The UP elections are going to be over within weeks. So
Right.
that is now the deterrence from a consumer's point of view. And because
Absolutely.
the oil prices are already hitting $100 a barrel. And if there is a war, I hope there won't be. But if there is a war, the oil prices are going to shoot, because Russia is a major energy exporter, and it is also the world's second largest gas exporter. So oil and gas prices are going to shoot up. So as consumer country, which is importing almost 70% of its energy requirements, I think it is going to hit India very bad if it happens. I think that would be the most significant economic impact on India.
Yes, absolutely. So the relation with domestic politics, of course. I do have another question, which is on UK. Now, amidst this chorus from the European nations, UK, as we said, the UK voice, we could say, is the most silent, or relatively the less audible. But despite that, UK, I bring this question since you brought the Suez crisis earlier in your lecture. The UK had always been a bridge in that case. See, even if you see the post-World War scenario, it was UK which was trying to, in a way, I think even Churchill said that Russia is a great power. So you need to respect that. But when you talk about the situation, then you have Americans who are coming into the new world as a new power. And a lot of that distrust, originated from that. And UK played the role of a bridge then, between an old great power like Russia and a new great power like the United States, which was, rising in the world scenario at the time. So do you think there is any possibility or some kind of a role which UK could play? Although if you look at the domestic situation in UK, it is totally different with the post-Brexit thing. But still, going forward, do you see any such scenario?
No, I am skeptical, because my view is that after Brexit, the United Kingdom lost even its last shred of influence in Europe.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Before that, it was at least seen as a major power within the European Union.
Correct.
But now, after the British exit from European Union, you see Germany and France are emerging. They are taking leadership of Europe. And they are the rightful leaders of Europe, in a sense, France being a military power and Germany being the largest economy of Europe. Whereas UK continues to sound like an echo from Washington, D.C. So even on the Ukraine crisis, they did the same thing, no? Yesterday, I found this tweet by the British Defense Ministry that says Putin's plans to invade with an arrow and all. I don't know. I find it a bit rather silly, because if we are talking about war strategies, and every general would like to maintain some kind of unpredictability about his military maneuvers, right? You
Correct.
won't publish your war plans on Twitter and then go to attack Ukraine. That
Yeah,
sounds silly to me. But yeah, so throughout the Ukraine crisis, I think, UK makes lots of noises. Nobody is paying any attention. That's why they are not audible.
exactly.
So yeah, so I don't think I'm very skeptical of British relevance, the relevance of Britain as a power in this whole conflict. The most interesting thing about great power status, if the history of international relations tells us, is that nothing is permanent about it. Britain
Correct.
used to be a great power. It's no longer a great power.
Correct. Correct. Absolutely. Can we we have time for 2 more questions? Is that fine?
Yeah, 3 more minutes. Can we wrap it up by 12:10?
Yes, sure. Then I'll limit that to just yeah, we can wrap it up in that. So this is a question from the audience who says, how much strategic space does Germany have in considering that they're heavily dependent on Russian gas and again export their economy, the export being dependent on China?
Yeah. So I think it's a two-way thing, right? When it comes to Germany and Russia, Germany is dependent on Russian gas. Yeah, that's right. 40% of Germany's gas imports are coming from Russia. On the other side, if you look at the Russian exports, huge chunk of Russian gas exports are going to Germany. So it's a two-way bridge. Both are dependent on each other. So that's why you see Germany, as you pointed out, Germany had taken a position that is sensitive to Russia's security concerns throughout this crisis. Germany said, fine, there will be sanctions, there will be costs. That's okay. You have to deter Putin from taking anything adventurous. But at the same time, Germany didn't send weapons to Ukraine. Germany, not just that, Germany even banned other NATO members from shipping German-made weapons to Ukraine. And then thirdly, Scholz went and met Putin in Kremlin. And then fourthly, he said, Ukraine is not joining NATO. So I think this is the reason. This explains the complex relationship between Germany and Russia. So while on the one side, Germany largely takes a stand along with the other European countries, Germany also, I think, is of the view that there has to be some kind of an accommodation of Russian concerns for a permanent solution to the security crisis. So in the case of China also, German exports to China is more than, if I am not wrong, more than $100 billion every year. So that's huge for Germany. But again, it's the same case, China is also seeing Germany, which is the largest economy in Europe and a major investor, as an important player. So the question which you asked earlier about Britain, whether Britain could play a bridge between these two, I think the question we can ask about Germany. We have to look out whether Germany, which definitely is the most important European player at this point of time, and whether Germany would be able to play this bridge between the conflicting or the competing great powers of our era.
Correct. And Germany has in the recent past, especially during the time of Angela Merkel, has taken a lot of leadership role in quite a lot of situations. So that makes perfect sense. Yeah. So I think in the interest of time, we'll wrap it up, the questions now. So I must say that this has been an extremely enriching session. We didn't just go through history, because we often say that most people often miss the connection between world history and how important world history, how important past events are in analyzing international politics, and you've covered it perfectly by bringing all those examples and analogies. And of course, we've gone through even theories of IR. We even visited theories of IR, Mearsheimer, offensive realism, and I'm sure the audience must have benefited from it. And yes, I think there's been so many takeaways: strategic disinterest, great power fatigue, and then, as you said, As we concluded, the larger goal of the current crisis seemed to be Vladimir Putin's